Hello, this is Brian Mandola, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the Saturday, February 14th issue of the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. Let's begin. Inside the debacle that led to the closure of El Paso airspace, the FAA citing a grave risk of fatalities from a new technology being used on Mexican border caught in the stalemate with the Pentagon that deemed the weapon necessary. Late spring in the early months of Stephen Feinberg's tenure as Deputy Defense Secretary, Pentagon staff members briefed him on the plans to employ a new high-energy laser weapons to take out drones being used on the Mexican cartels to smuggle drugs across the U.S. border. There was a condition on getting a green light from aviation safety officials. The law the staff members at the Pentagon explained to him required extensive coordination of the Federal Aviation Administration and the Transportation Department, which could slow testing of the system. Transportation officials could even block this system use if they determined it was posed a risk to aviation safety. Two people with the knowledge of the meeting who spoke on the condition of the autonomy because they were not authorized to discuss sensitive matters said they recall that Mr. Feinberg felt that the Pentagon had the authority to proceed anyway. Sean Parnell and the chief Pentagon spokesperson denied their account, saying it was a total fabrication. The meeting took place at an especially sensitive time for those regulating air safety as well as the Pentagon. Just months earlier, an Army helicopter collided with a passenger jet near Ronald Reagan National Airport above Washington, killing 67 people and putting military safety protocols under intense scrutiny. Now the question of whether the Pentagon and Department of Homeland Security followed those procedures and protocols at the end and to the law, deploying the laser weapons that has become a flashpoint within the Trump administration. Working alongside the military personnel agents and Customs and Border Protection, which is part of the Homeland Security Department, used the weapon this week not far from the El Paso International Airport, prompting fury inside the FAA and a brief shutdown of the airport and the airspace in the region. Late Tuesday night, the FAA administration and an administrator, Brian Bedford, caught off guard that the system was being used without authorization and concerned for the public safety believed they had a little choice but to close the airspace for 10 days, according to more than a half dozen people. It was an extraordinary decision that surprised the flying public and local officials. Under pressure of the White House, Mr. Bedford rescinded the order on Wednesday, setting off a bout of finger-pointing within the administration that continued throughout the week. Administration officials told reporters that the FAA did not warn the White House or the Pentagon. It was about to severely limit flights over the city of nearly 700,000 residents. But internal government communication reviewed the New York Times tell a very different story. In one email, dated February 6th, the FAA's top lawyer warned the Pentagon officials that deploying the laser system without restricting flights created a grave risk of fatalities or permanent injuries to Americans traveling through the airspace. Another email dated Tuesday showed that the lawyer gave official notification to the 14 government employees, including senior official Defense Department as well as staff members of the White House National Security Council, of the FAA's intention to close the airspace above the Army base adjacent to the El Paso because the laser technology had been used without its approval. Publicly, the administration had yet to acknowledge that a department standoff over those weapons led to the airspace closure. Even the rationale for deploying the laser system is in dispute. Senior administration officials described the incident of having been prompted by a drone crossing into the United States from Mexico, an explanation repeated by Transport Secretary Sean Duffy this week. White House officials declined to comment on Friday and referred to the social media post from Mr. Duffy published on Wednesday that said administration, quote, acted swiftly to address a cartel drone insurrection. But the narrative was disputed by multiple people familiar with the situation, who said the Border Protection Unit ended up shooting down the party balloon rather than the drone itself. Military service members were present during the incident, said the people. For the better part of last year, Mr. Duffy and the FAA leaders have been locked in a war of wills with the National Secretary's counterparts over aviation safety. The aftermath of the mid-air collision at the National Airport exposed the fractious nature of the relationship between the FAA and the Defense Department, as Mr. Duffy scrambled to put the safety restrictions in place and the military maneuvered to sidestep them. For much of that same time frame, the FAA and the Pentagon were also engaged in discussion over the military plans to begin testing counter-drone laser against the cross-border threats from drug cartels. The Pentagon had insisted that the FAA that used lasers did not pose a risk to civilized aircraft, but the FAA, unconvinced, had asked the military's data an opportunity to conduct its own tests according to the three people with knowledge of those discussions. The requests were not satisfied. In late January, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth approved a request to the Department of Homeland Security to allow the Border Protection agents to use the Pentagon's new anti-drone laser technology. It was around the same time that Mark Roosevelt Ditzsullivan, a principal deputy assistant defense secretary specializing in homeland defense, sent an email to the FAA's chief counsel, William McKenna, informing the aviation officials of the military's desire to start using its own technology. Quote, we have operationalized a stationary laser system near El Paso, Mr. Ditzsullivan wrote, according to a January 23rd email reviewed by the Times. The Pentagon knew that the FAA was still conducting an internal review of the weapons he had, but the National Security and Homeland Security Council officials, quote, are aware of this, he added, and agreed to make sure this makes sense for the Defense Department to do whatever he feels is necessary. On February 6, Mr. McKenna wrote back detailing the FAA's concern about the potential death of injuries to the passengers, offering to put up the flight restrictions in the areas where the Defense Department proposed to deploy its lasers. Mr. McKenna declined to comment on this article. Then, in the dark morning hours of February 9th, members of the CBP tactical unit, who had been trained how to use these counter-drone lasers by the Army, decided to deploy one, while members of the military looked on. They aimed at the laser at what they thought was a drone flying over the Army's Fort Bliss though it turned out to be a metallic balloon. It was first known of domestic use of the weapon by federal officials outside the controlled environment, according to two people with the knowledge of the technology, and it was a drone without the FAA's approval and the possible violation of the law. At 5:16 p.m. that same day, hours after the laser system has been used, Mr. Dibbleton responded to the FAA's lawyers that the Pentagon was not changing its position of its use. While I can't appreciate your concerns, he said, we feel we have not met the requirement to coordinate with your organization. He wrote to Mr. McKenna, copying senior Pentagon officials as well as staff members from the National Security Council. He noted that he was, quote, looking forward to coming up to an upcoming meeting to discuss with lasers. Officials at the FAA were furious, according to multiple people familiar with the fallout. Agency's officials had booked up the mitigation meeting that had been planned since February 20th, in which the FAA had hoped to gain information that would satisfy the remaining concerns. It didn't happen. It is clearly precisely when or how the FAA learned how to shoot down the balloon. But at least by Tuesday morning, the agency top officials were clearly aware of what they had made up in their minds. Concerned that their system could be used again without FAA clearance, they would close the airspace above El Paso for 10 days. The significance of that length of time is still unclear. The agency notified that Mr. Duffy was in favor of the plan, according to 3 people who were briefed in this matter. Mr. McKenna that dispatched a written notification, Mr. Deppelson that had been copied more than a dozen times, and a dozen counterparts at the White House and Defense Department, according to the document reviewed by the Times. Quote, I have discussed this with the FAA administrator, Mr. McKenna wrote. Given the Pentagon had now operationalized a high-energy laser, he wrote that he had directed the assurance of a temporary flight restriction to ensure the aviation safety in the area. In other words, by 6:30 Tuesday, in Washington, the FAA had explicitly warned the Pentagon and National Security Council that it would be shutting down the airspace above Fort Bliss until things, quote, iron out. The restrictions had been for 7 hours later. But it was unclear whether those warnings ever made their way to Mr. Hegseth, President Trump, or other senior-most officials, or his senior-most staff. The integrity process and a trope under Mr. Trump, who had dramatically shrunk the size of the National Security Council during the second term, even as a portfolio of international crisis has grown. And when the FAA had its move, many of Washington was still asleep. It was 10:32 on the East Coast when the FAA issued orders that all flights under 18,000 feet would be banned beginning at 11:30 p.m. El Paso time. The order covered not only the airspace for Fort Bliss, but also pertaining to El Paso's International Airport and desolate area of New Mexico and a desolate area in New Mexico west of the Army base. By Wednesday morning, Susie Wells, Mr. Trump's chief of staff, had ordered the FAA to reopen the airspace, and the blame game had already begun. Despite the war of words, the FAA had already won at least one concession, according to 2 people that briefed in the matter. The new lasers had been taken out of commission for the moment. On Friday, when asked about Mr. Duffy, the president said he was doing a, quote, great job. Headline, TSA workers brace for another shutdown they didn't cause. As Congress leaves town without funding their department, airport security officers wonder, how many more times am I going to be able to do this? When the Department of Homeland Security ran out of funding early Saturday, employees of the Transportation Security Administration assumed an unfamiliar and unfortunate familiar role, the face of the latest impasse in Congress. Lawmakers left town this week without a deal to fund the department over the disagreement about relying in the Trump administration of hardline immigration enforcement tactics. Most of the hardships faced by its employees who are working without pay will go unnoticed by the public, with a few possible exceptions, including people who check ID, scan baggage, and complete other security tasks at the U.S. airports. Several previous government shutdowns ended in the TSA workforce began to buckle in a way that started to inconvenience the travelers to a pressure point that could come in 2 weeks from now, when TSA employees will miss their first full paycheck while continuing to incur normal cost of living. That especially hits hard for TSA employees at this time around because they have been coming out of the financial strain they suffered during the last 43-day shutdown. Some were evicted from their homes, others couldn't afford gas to commute to the airport, and some could not afford medicine or daycare for their children. And some are still bitter that they didn't receive their $10,000 bonus that the Homeland Security Kristi Noem said would be awarded to those exemplary service during last shutdown. Everybody is really nervous, said Roberto Echerva, a lead transportation security officer in Salt Lake City International Airport. He said that some of his colleagues would be preparing for this scenario for the past month, trying to pick up as much overtime as possible for what somewhat have a cushion of what they would be missing for their first paycheck. Mr. Icharva was a member of the union chapter of the American Federation of Government Employees and said the TSA in the Salt Lake City region based on the employment range of $36,480 to $49,920.
You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service.
He said that he may have his colleagues were asking themselves the same question. How many more times am I going to be able to do this? Even though they will eventually be paid back for the hours they worked, it is extremely stressful in this situation. Adding to the Salt Lake City's lost 100 officers since the beginning of the last shutdown. Officers are frustrated that they have to pay full price for the political fights that they had nothing to do with, and even worse at this time, because they have been working without pay while immigration officers will continue to be paid through this separate fund. This totally affects the wrong people that they're targeting, said Rebecca Wolf, a longtime TSA employee and the president of the Federation of Government Employees, TSA Local Union 1127. Last year's shutdown affected all federal agencies relied on congressional appropriations. That stalemate was overextending health care subsidies. Democrats wanted to continue offering government subsidies for health coverage for certain Americans, which expired at the end of last year. Republicans did not. There are partial government shutdown earlier this year that lasted just a few days. Quote, we are never the focus, but we are the ones that are, for lack of a better word, punished. Because of those on the Hill couldn't come up with an agreement to do their jobs, said Ms. Wolf, whose local union chapter representative employees across 6 states. The last shutdown also came to, as of Trump administration, is trying to strip the agency of collective bargaining rights, a move that initiated last year, but was halted by a judge over the lawyers of the TSA union, who were in court again last month fighting to retain the union rights. The judge ruled in the union's favor, but the threat of losing bargaining rights hangs heavily over the workforce, said Ms. Wolf. And the financial hardships of the TSA workforce inevitably reaches by the traveling public. Hay Wynn McNeil, the agency's senior official performing the duties of the administrator, told Congress on Wednesday that financial hardships, such as the lack of child care, could lead to officers calling out for the last minute, which could be a result in longer wait times at checkpoints, leading to the missed and delayed flights, which is cascading a negative impact across the American economy. The prospect of long lines at the airport could deepen the worries and travelers which had cite concerns about the stability and safety of the aviation system. Last-minute announcement and changes by the government, such as the recent brief suspension of all flights in the El Paso area, have already rattled travelers recently. And there has been no mention of the possibility of bonuses for transportation security officers after the shutdown. The criteria of their bonuses was never clear. Several officers told the New York Times that they were not awarded fairly. Quote, it was not being a contest where you don't know the rules, said William Kincaid, a lead transportation security officer at Helena Regional Airport in Montana. The Homeland Security Department did not respond to these questions about the bonus recipients. A spokesperson for the Transportation Security Mission said bonuses were awarded to the employees of the extraordinary efforts, including showing up to work and often volunteering for extra shifts. Going to the next shutdown, bringing the added stress of uncertainty around whether there was a clear guidance of management about schedules and pay by the TSA agents. Mr. Kincaid, a union shop steward in Helena, Montana, said the TSA employees were not getting much guidance from management beyond the instructions to stay off social media while they were in their uniforms. He said that some managers had told their officers to wear the TSA jackets in public after an incident in last month of which the TSA employees were eating at the Los Angeles airport restaurant, which were mistaken as ICE officers. Mr. Kincaid said the type of mix-up was ridiculous, even though they were working at the same department. We're just helping people get through the airport so that they can go on their trip, he said. Our next headline. Sick detainees describe the poor care at facilities run by ICE contractors. Problems at detention center operated by Core Civic extended far beyond the recent measles outbreak. Cases of the measles, a highly contagious virus that spread in close quarters, cropped in the near two centers of the unauthorized immigrants in Arizona and Texas last month. The centers are almost 1,000 miles apart, yet they have one thing in common. They are operated by Core Civic. The publicly traded detention company had secured contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars since President Trump took office last year. But it has an checkered track record of providing medical care to the people in these facilities. In recent years, it has been accused of falsifying records and disguising unsafe working conditions, failing to provide the life-saving medications, and being slow to take critically ill people to the hospital, according to the court records. Government audits, sworn declarations, and interviews with lawyers and people who were detained. Core Civic disputed these accusations, saying it provides quality medical care to Central Arizona's Florence Correctional Center and in Florence, a Dilley Immigration Processing Center in Texas. Health officials said that last week the spread of measles was limited to and appears to have stopped. But aside from the outbreaks, more than a dozen of detainees of immigration lawyers and in both states detain details in sanctuary and unsanitary conditions and lack of care. They described the hours-long wait times to see the nurse, only to be turned away and told that they were not sick enough to receive care. People with injuries often wait days, even weeks, to receive x-rays. Diabetic patients lack regular access to insulin, and people hoping to see outside specialists, such as cancer doctors or dentists, are frequently denied. Many of the detainees and their lawyers said that those lucky enough to see a doctor had to get prescriptions from drugs sometimes must wait days or even weeks before medication arrives, as they said. Illness spreads rapidly through the facilities, and detainees and their lawyers said acceleration by sleeping quarters that are often cramped by communal bathrooms that are so filthy. Two families and one immigration lawyer said in an interview that when several children fell ill with the stomach ailments at Dilley, Core Civic's medical staff refused to treat them unless they had a real severe case of vomiting that lasted more than at least 8 times. Last month, an 18-month-old at Dilley was taken to Regional Children's Hospital with dangerously low blood oxygen levels after her parents begged for weeks at someone at the facility to address her illness. The parents said that in an emergency petition at her release, a 35-year-old woman released last week said medical staff initially refused to see her after she began hemorrhaging profusely, soaking through 6 sanitary pads in an hour. She was ultimately taken to the hospital and last summer a 32-year-old man died at a Florence center after being detained at the facility for roughly 3 weeks. The man had been detained even though they were seriously ill with diabetes and recently had been hospitalized with a dangerous high blood sugar spike. The federal government issues national standards that require that detainees receive access to appropriate medical, dental, and medical care, including emergency services. But an influx of detainees under Mr. Trump had aggravated these problems with the medical care in the Core Civics facilities. Legal records and inception of documents and interviews show. In a statement Thursday, a spokesperson from Core Civics, Stephen Owen, said nothing matters more to Core Civic than the health and safety of its people in our care. He noted that our facilities are routinely passed government inspections, and so the report's standards care, quote, simply do not reflect the hard work of our staff does every day to help people in our facilities to get the care that they need. He said children had gastrointestinal symptoms such as vomiting are evaluated and given appropriate medical care. A Department of Homeland Security spokesperson said the immigrants are in detention by choice because they are allowed to exit if they voluntarily leave the country. The Trump administration had been offering $2,600 and a free flight to people who do so. Detainees receive comprehensive medical care from the moment they enter their custody. The spokesperson said, quote, this is the best health care that many aliens have received in their entire lives. Founded by the Correction Corporation of America in 1983. CoreCivic is one of the first for-profit prisons companies in the country. In 2016, it changed its name as it pivoted away from prisons, and Thursday, CoreCivic executives told investors that 23% of immigration and customs enforcement detainees are in facilities run by the government, and that ICE is the company's largest customer. The Trump administration pushed to arrest deport millions of people in reshaping the makeup of the country's more than 200 immigration detention facilities. The detainee population ballooned to 68,000 people in February, compared to about 40,000 1 year ago, according to ICE. The surge includes more people with chronic disease, as well as pregnant women, older people who are intensive round-the-clock care, according to interviews with detainees. Their lawyers and the congressional reports. More than a dozen pregnant women who are been housed by the facility in Basel, Louisiana, when Senate staff visited the last spring, according to a subsequent report. For decades, including during Mr. Trump's first term, many immigrants facing deportation were not put into detention, but allowed them to live their lives in the communities until these cities were resolved. Complaints about the medical care CoreCivic facilities predate the second Trump administration. In 2016, a measles outbreak at CoreCivic Detention Center in Eloy, Arizona, infected 31 people. Many of its workers were not vaccinated, health officials said, and 9 employees got sick. In 2022, the Department of Homeland Security Inspector General found critical staffing shortages at CoreCivic facility in Torrance, New Mexico, and recommended that all detainees be removed immediately. That never happened. Last February, lawyers representing the whistleblowers who had been work at the facility told Congress that the company had grossly mismanaged at the medical operations. CoreCivic leader chronically maintained several and severe understaffing at the medical, dental, and mental health units in Torrance, jeopardizing patient health care safety. According to the letter at their lawyers who wrote to Congress, that the whistleblower also claimed the company had falsified records to make it look like companies were complying with safety standards. Mr. Owen said that ICE had disputed the Inspector General's findings from 2022, and he noted that since then, the faculty has not been cited since the deficiencies in care. A nurse at the CoreCivic facility in San Diego has raised similar claims in 2024. In February 2024, the nurse sued CoreCivic for wrongful termination. In their lawsuit, she claimed that she had been forced to face retaliation after raising alarms about medical care. She accused the company of operating with skeletal staffing, sometimes just 2 nurses for 1,500 detainees. That led to one man developing a dangerous infection and another to go into multiple organ failure. The lawsuit was settled confidentially. Mr. Owen, the spokesperson for CoreCivic, denied that the nurse was fired because she raised concerns about medical care. Family members and a local Democratic state representative have raised questions about the death in August of Lorenzo Antonio Barthez Vargas, a 32-year-old man who died in CoreCivic's Florence facility. Mr. Vargas had multiple health problems, including diabetes, elevated blood sugar, and a foot wound that contracted COVID. While he was in detention center, according to the initial ICE summary of his death, Mr. Vargas was found unresponsive and later pronounced dead. The summary details how medical staff checked Mr. Vargas' blood sugar levels in multiple occasions until it was isolated with COVID. There was no mention of those checks continuing after that. The DHS spokesperson, Mr. Vargas, was provided with proper medical care, so the cause of death was still being under investigation. In a GoFundMe page raised money for funeral costs for Mr. Vargas, families described the death as tragically compounded by the circumstances until he died, alone likely of complications of COVID without the medical attention he deserved. The family declined to comment. Mr. Owens, spokesperson of CoreCivic, referred comment on individual detainees' cases to ICE. He said all detainees can sign up for medical care and health care as well. Emergency care is always available, and the company coordinates access to outside specialists in hospitals.
You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service.
Went on. At Dilley, which is 70 miles south of San Antonio, immigration lawyers have logged more than 1,000 complaints of poor medical care since the facility was reopened by the Trump administration last April. According to the Fasil Ajaber, the co-chief executive at the Refugee and Immigration Center for Education and Legal Services for RICES, which represents immigration and refugee families in Texas. As of January, more than 1,200 people were detained at Dilley, according to ICE. Alora Mukherjee, an immigration lawyer who represented the families at Dilley, said that their clients were consistently sick. They were coughing, they had fevers, and they were not really feeling well. One mother and father from Russia had been to Dilley since October, said they were sworn declaration in an interview that when they arrived, their 11-year-old daughter had an earache, but the medical staff did an examination and dismissed them. They returned repeatedly as the daughter developed even a fever of above 104 degrees, only to be told that her problems were caused by allergies, they said. She eventually was given eardrops and antibiotics, but lost some of her hearing while she was still in pain as her family noticed that pus was coming out of her ear. As of last week, her hearing had not fully returned, as they said. The mother, who was named Oksana, said the patients at the Dilley who need medicine often must wait for long times outside the evening. One worker mocked the children crying in line, she said. Oksana and the other detainees spoke on the condition in that their last names being withheld because they were afraid of retaliation. In other cases, families reported that staff downplayed their concerns until they became a medical emergency. In January, 18-month-old Amelia developed a fever that lasted nearly 19 days and lost 2 pounds, according to the medical review provided by the lawyer. She spent several days in the hospital and diagnosed with COVID, pneumonia, and other infections. The DHS spokesperson said that Amelia received proper medical care. Anastasia, the 35-year-old mother whose hemorrhaging led through her six sanitary pads, said that she was eventually taken to the hospital after pleading with staff and after they demanded proof that she was complied by showing them all her bloody pads. She was prescribed medication that took weeks to arrive, she said, as the bleeding continued. Late last week, she and her family were released after spending nearly 120 days at Dilley. Days later, Core Civic reported its fourth quarter earnings. Revenue ICE more than doubled, and the company's chief executive boasted that 2026 was already shaping up to be another year of strong growth. Democratic debates: abolish ICE or abolish Trump's ICE. An upcoming Senate primary contest in Illinois, which is likely to pick state's next senator, has centered on Democrats' future approaching the federal immigration policy. The three-way battle between Democrat-run Senate and Illinois has evolved into an argument about the best way to combat President Trump's deportation agenda. Is it better to abolish ICE? So Lieutenant Governor Julietta Stratton offers to abolish Trump's ICE, as Representative Raja Krishnamurthy promises. The contest and the third candidate, Representative Robin Kelly, said the country could not just abolish the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement without a plan to replace the agency border enforcement function. But she introduced legislation last month to impeach Kristi Noem, the Homeland Security Secretary, a bill that Mr. Kashif Moradi quickly signed onto. The 10-year of the Illinois race had focused on immigration when the Trump administration sent federal agents to Chicago last fall and then shifted fully into a deportation policy after Border Patrol agents shot and killed Alex Peretti in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The three Senate candidates who aren't split by major ideology and policy differences now offer a window into the Democratic who could approach the dismantling of Mr. Trump's immigration enforcement structure if they win back a full control of Washington. Early voting has begun in March for the March 17th primary race. There is evidence that in other contests that a strong anti-ICE agenda can work in a low turnout Democratic primaries. Last week in New Jersey, Ananya Majadi won 13 presidential special primary election, running as a most progressive candidate in the field onto a pledge to abolish ICE. Democratic anger Mr. Trump's deportation policies led to a shutdown of the Department of Homeland Security while funding expired this weekend. And yet, ambitious Democrats who saw how calls to abolish ICE and defund the police hurt the party in recent years after concerns of running into a definitive message to abolish the agency's risk policies, if not in 2026, then beyond. They are all about attacking ICE. They're all saying abolish ICE or abolish or change the department, said William Delaney, a former White House chief of staff who is the son and brother of a longtime Chicago mayor who has endorsed Mr. Camaracci. Do away with ICE is closer to defunding the police that got Democrats in trouble, so they are a little uncomfortable with that. Mr. Camaracci said they're calling the abolish Trump's ICE to a phrase he is using in television ads, debates, and on the campaign trail. He's using the same language that Governor J.B. Pritzker, the state's top Democrat who had endorsed Ms. Stratton and funded a super PAC for her. And yet, it is not evident that voters differentiate between the two abolished messages. It's checking the box, said Representative Mike Quaggy, a Chicago Democrat who has not endorsed a primary candidate. No one is going to say, "Oh, you hate ICE more than she does. I'm not going to vote for you." You say abolish, the magic word, and I don't think voters can discern the difference. Mr. Camaracci, a 5-term House member, long seen as ambitious in the state's full, sharp-elbowed politicians, has a decided financial advantage. He has spent $25 million on television and digital advertising compared to the $1.1 million of Miss Kelly and the $63,000 by Ms. Stratton, according to the Ad Impact, a media tracking firm. Ms. Stratton, in an interview Friday, said that she was going to get her campaign message out getting her campaign message out without paying for advertising, though she had said that she would be buying into television very soon. There are a lot of ways people are getting their information, she said, citing engagement with the social media creators and grassroots activists. I'm really proud of the way that we have engaged people by using some of the non-traditional methods. The winner of the Democratic Party is expected to become the next Illinois senator. Republicans were not sworn in who had not won a statewide election since 2014 and did not have a well-known, well-financed candidates in their primary. The seat is being vacated by Senator Dick Durbin, a Democrat who is retiring after 5 terms in the Senate. When the race kicked off last spring, it was expected that many of Illinois' Democrats to serve as a test of Mr. Kersey's clout in the Senate. Ms. Stratton had chosen the candidate to be lackluster funding, and despite the charismatic presence of the super PAC, largely by Mr. Pretzker's a super PAC funded largely at Mr. Pretzker's family had spent over $9 million to boost Ms. Stratton. Is the most money Ms. Stratton has invested influence a party since it spent more than $35 million to support a far-right Republican candidate for governor in the 4 years ago, which had helped ease the path for re-election. 4 months in the primary had been relatively sleepy one-sided by Mr. Kemmereth, who had the airways himself last summer and fall, built a double-digit lead in the public polling, much of the sponsoring by one of the candidates in the race and their supporters. In recent weeks, Ms. Stratton claimed that their momentum in the race had claimed momentum in their race and performances campaigned in many debates. There are 3 debates scheduled next week alone. She had attacked Mr. Kemmerer for voting in July for the House resolution. Both condemned the anti-Semitism, expressed gratitude for law enforcement, including immigration officials. Quote, the congressman who can use whatever words he wants, but the bottom line is this. Congressman Camerucci could not be trusted to stand to ICE to hold them accountable because he voted for them to say, thanks, ICE, said Ms. Stratton. In an interview with Mr. Camerucci, defended his vote on the resolution after being anti-Semitism. Ms. Stratton had argued he was going after him to mask her own lack of ideas about her and how to improve people's lives. If you're just attacking on the debate stage, I think people are starting to conclude that maybe you don't have a specific ideas of helping them with their challenges, he said. They just concluded that looks like business as usual. We need to be something different. And then there's Ms. Kelly, who was talking about immigration, who had focused on her impeachment of Ms. Noem. She is seen widely as in the state running to continue her year-long grudge against Mr. Paxter. She defeated her chosen candidate to be the chair of the Illinois Democratic Party in 2021, and then engineered her as an outsider in 2022. Ms. Kelly, who is black, remains Ms. Stratton in the remains behind Ms. Stratton in the polling, and many Illinois Democrats say that her presence on the ballot was likely to have some black votes away from Ms. Stratton, who is also black, and by proximity of Mr. Paxter. I know people say that mess, but he's not that big in life, quite frankly. This is just rubber. This is the rubber match, you know. I've won, he won. I won one, he's won one. It should be about her, not about JB, but definitely with all the money gotten into the race, I do not even think about it, to be honest with you. I could say the same thing if she's taking votes away from me. Mr. Paxter, through an aide, declined to comment.
You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Our next headline, Welcome to the Voyage of the Damned. Opinion piece, Maureen Dowd. When President Trump vindicated scientific facts on Thursday, helping fossil fuels fat cats by eliminating the government's ability to regulate treacherous gases, a reporter asked what he says to people worried about the real hazard of a hotter planet. Quote, I tell them, don't worry about it, he shot back. The administration has even coined a word to degrade those who push back on the Trump's rash policies as a pan-ican, P-A-N-I-C-A-N, as one who panics. In a world steeped in violence and menace, we are consistently being told by the people in charge not to worry. Don't worry about the sweltering earth. Don't worry about those powerful creeps getting away with abusing young women exploited by Jeffrey Epstein. Instead, just behold the beauty of a rising Dow, as the abrasive, evasive Pam Bundy suggests at the congressional hearing on Wednesday. Don't worry about Trump's family unethical get-rich-quick schemes. Don't worry about an economic increasingly catered to the well-connected. Don't worry about the president's threatening to unilaterally set rules for state elections. Congress be damned. The pure artane of Silicon Valley have greased their palm of the King Joffrey in the White House. And now we are told not to worry about the safeguard of AI, the most spine-tingling technology ever created. I interviewed Elon Musk in 2017 when he still cared about AI safety as much as one would care about the wildest party on Epstein Island, and now cares about consistently sharing degraded posts about race on X. He told me that the fate of humanity depends on not allowing the algorithms to be concealed and concentrated in the hands of tech and government elites. Quote, it's great when emperors is Marcus Aurelius, Musk said then. It's not so great when the emperor is Caligula. Let's just say that our man in the White House is no Marcus Aurelius. When I reported on Silicon Valley back in the debate was whether AI would jump to the dark side once it got smarter than us. But since then, even the tech gods who had once had good intentions had gone to the dark side, seduced by billions to be made by AI, including on erotica. These geniuses, who were supposed to escort us into a better, safer future, turned out to be the biggest sellouts of all time. Sam Altman, OpenAI's chief executive, have Open Erotica, or, quote, adult mode, end quote, as it's called, saying he wants to treat adult users like adults. Once Musk put up an AI-generated picture of himself in a bikini to demonstrate his AI model. New feature of people use it to, quote, manipulate pictures of women online, stripping off their clothes. The tech bros are thrilled with the ability to buy influence in Trump's world. Yes, Jeff Bezos, I'm talking about Melania, end quote. As Wired reports said, the president of OpenAI, Greg Brockman, was one of the Trump's biggest individual donors in 2025, to the tune of $25 million. Another $25 million is on the way to a PAC that fights politicians who favor regulating AI. OpenAI's original mission ways to protect humanity. But where's the money in that? The tech universe shuddered this week at alarms with several Paul Revere's. An urgent post on X titled "Something Big is Happening" by Matt Schumer, the CEO of the two small tech companies, went viral. He warned that AI is leaping ahead faster than we think. Quote, "The future is being shaped by the remarkably small number of people, a few hundred researchers and a handful of companies. OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, DeepMind," he wrote, and adding, "I am no longer needed for the actual technical work on my job. I tell the AI what I want, walk away from my computer for 4 hours, and come back to find the work being done, and done well, done better than I ever would have done myself." Now, he wrote, OpenAI's newest model is showing judgment, and it knows how to make its right calls on its own. On Monday, the Anthropic AI safety researcher, Marniek Sharman, quit his job, posting about the apocalyptic warning on X that, quote, the world is in peril from AI, bioweapons, and cascading crisis. Anthropic's CEO Dario Armandi have been the most responsible tech executives in acknowledging the awesome hair-curling power of AI, saying it will test who we are as a species and reveal whether humanity has matured and the maturity to handle the almost unimaginable power. The Wall Street Journal reported Friday that the company's AI tool, Claude, have helped the American military Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro. Sharma is not sure if humanity has maturity to handle AI. I repeatedly seen how hard he has worked, and it truly let our values govern our actions. He said he will disappear to England and pursue a poetry degree, signing off a William Stafford poem containing a line that argued AI's dominance. Quote, "Nothing you can do stops time unfolding," end quote. Zoe Hetzig, a researcher of OpenAI, also quit on Monday. In a guest essay for the New York Times, she said that she had lost faith that OpenAI still wanted to back her work on two outcomes that she fears most of. Quote, technology that manipulates the people who uses it with no cost, and the exclusivity benefits the few who can afford to use it. Another OpenAI executive, Ryan Burmeister, lost her job in the safety division after complaining about ChatGPT's rollout of AI erotica, the journal disclosed. Burmeister, the journal said, did not think the company had enough guardrails in place to stop child exploitation content and wall off adult content from teens. OpenAI claimed Burmeister's departure was due to a sexual discrimination against a male colleague. She immediately denied this claim in the journal. Despite the smary reassurance of the tech lords, some AI insiders are alarmed by what they're seeing. Some people are in charge to tell us not to worry, but we should worry. It's getting scary out there. It's nothing artificial about that. Our next headline, by Lydia Polgreen. I trusted Jeff Bezos. The joke's on me. In June 2017, in one of the most strange turn of events in my life, I found myself at a dinner in the Palazzo in Turin, Italy, sitting next to Jeff Bezos. We had both been invited to speak at a conference convened by the Italian billionaires to discuss the future of newspapers. I, also the editor of the Huffington Post, and Bezos as the owner of the Washington Post, which he had bought 4 years earlier. I was surprised, and I'll confess, a little delighted to find myself alongside the man of the hour. Besides, Bezos had to cut quite a figure at the conference, offering a passionate case for plowing more resources into the heart and soul of the newspaper he pledged to rebuild. Quote, What they needed was a little bit of a runaway and the encouragement to experiment and stop shrinking, he said to the Post newsroom. You can't shrink your way into relevance. Under his ownership, the paper had added about 140 reporters and rounded the corner to profitability on to back its journalists' verve in breaking big stories. This was music to my ears. It had been especially a bruising month from the industry, and hundreds of journalists had lost their jobs. I had been asked to slash the staff by the Huffington Post, which I had joined 6 months earlier as part of a cost-cutting exercise tied to our parent company and acquisition of Yahoo. For reasons I can't scarcely understand, the deal required laying off 39 journalists, along with more than 2,000 other employees. Yet here was another of the richest, most celebrated business titans in the world, urging the opposite course. As we dug into our scrumptious meal, and in an ancient hall filled with media grands, I made a nervous, self-deprecating crack about being cynical, wretch of out of place amid the splendor. Bezos quickly corrected me. Great journalists, he said, were not cynical. They were skeptical, as they should be. I offered a sheepish grin, charmed to hear him echo the credo of my earliest, most grizzled newsroom mentors. Maybe I thought this guy was trusting. Turns out the joke was on me and on journalism. Last week, the Washington Post laid off nearly half of its staff, according to a recent accounting from the Newsroom Guild, removing brave foreign correspondents, axing its celebrated sports section, gutting the Metro reporting staff, and more. The cuts, the paper lender said, were aimed to stem losses, enticing Bezos to keep investing. The paper was, in other words, an attempt to shrink its way into relevance, not with the audience, but with the unfathomable wealthy, highly distracted owner whose fortune has more than doubled in the 9 years since I met him. Its newly unemployed journalists, by contrast, face a bleak job market as their colleagues and friends pass the digital tin cup to raise money to support them. This wanton destruction took me back to the encounter with Bezos. Why, I wondered, did I trust him? Trust is an elusive quality nowadays, seeming vanished from the public life. That disappearance is particularly acute in the news media, and as news research this week from Pew underscored, analysis of polling found that 57% of Americans, quote, expressed low confidence in journalists to act in the best interest of the public. On its face, this looks like an existential problem for journalism. What good is reporting the news if people don't trust it? Restoring trust everyone tends to agree with is the worthy goal. But in an age of digital platforms, algorithms filtering the declining media leniency and literacy, there is no simple recipe for doing so. More fundamentally, the standard exploitation for why trust in journalism has plummeted, and so implicity, how one would go about fixing it, is misleading. The conventional story goes something like this. Once journalists stuck into the facts and reported the world as it was, hewing to the who, what, when, where, and why, giving each side a chance to present its case, letting the readers make up their own minds. Then, amid the great social upheavals of the 60s and 70s, journalists became partisan and news became slanted to represent one side. The problem accelerated with the advent of new avenues where journalism appeared. Cable news in the 80s, and more shattering social media emerging in the 2000s. But there's more problem with this account. It leaves out what journalists actually looked like. The period in the 70s to turn the century when trust in news organizations fell sharply was a golden age of news gathering, one in which newspapers had a fat profit margins and invested heavily in high-quality journalism. Far from a time of failure, it was a period of astonishing advances in quality and ambition. The early triumphs of the era, the Pentagon Papers published by the Times, the Washington Post, Watergate's investigation, are legendary. Yet more generally, the period was marked by a deep cultural shift in journalism, away from route reporting on the events of the day toward the more aggressive investigations and more analytical writings about the increasingly complex world. The statue of journalists rose. One went screwball comedies like His Girl Friday, and in came serious thrillers like All the President's Men. At the end of the century, a journalism scholar published a fascinating comparative study of regional newspapers in the 1960s and the late 1990s. Quote, papers of the 1960s seem naive, trusting of government, shamelessly boosterish, unembarrassingly hokey, and obliging. Carol Sessions Steep, the researcher, wrote the newspapers of the 90s were, quote, better written, better looking, better organized, more responsible, less sensational, less sexist and racist, and more informative to a public spirited. This sounds you might think salutary for health of the democracy, but it may have been precisely this move away from the differential stenography and toward the fearless investigation that led to the declining trust of the news media. Aggressive probing of accountability-oriented journalism held up a mirror to the American society, and many Americans did not like what they saw. Quote, as news grew more negative and more critical, people have been more find a reason to find journalism distasteful. The media scholar Michael Shruden wrote in a proactive essay on the problem of assessing the trust in journalism. Quote, what people do not like about the media is its implicit or explicit criticism of their heroes or their home teams. No one famously liked the bearers of bad news. Thinking back to that dinner with Bezos, I realized that something is similar that happened. He flattened my chosen profession, reassured me that it was not a cynical undertaking, but something much more notable. He told me, in short, what I wanted to hear, and won my trust in the intervening years. Bezos had apparently decided that his flattery is better aimed at a very different audience, Donald Trump. During the 2024 presidential campaign, Bezos notoriously demanded that the Post spike its plan of endorsement of Kamala Harris, at a great cost to the paper, mind you. After the election, he donated $1 million to Trump's inaugural committee and joined the row of poltercats at the inauguration. Amazon paid $40 million for the rights to the documentary of Melania Trump, spent tens of millions of dollars more to market the movie, and donated to Trump's absurd White House mega ballroom project. It's certainly one way to win trust. The Post lost its other gains. It's possible its best-known journalists have steamed out of the door, joining thriving news organizations like The Atlantic, The Wall Street Journal, and The Times. These companies' successes built on aggressive and independent reporting make me wonder whether the handwritten about trust is misplaced in the new Gilded Age. Maybe we should set aside the trust, as Bezos himself once urged, and embrace skepticism.
You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the Saturday, February 14th issue of the front section of the New York Times. We read the front section of the New York Times every Sunday at 1 p.m. Your reader today has been me, Brian Mendola. Thanks for listening.